Nyadik Shinwenwen. Good morning, everybody. Kevin Loringhan Schwest. I am the Artistic Director of Indigenous Theatre here at the National Arts Centre of Canada. And I want to welcome you all here to the Sphere Festival and the Arctic Imagination Speaker Series. I have some wonderful guests here today. And the Arctic Imagination is a speaker series hosted by the National Arts Centre Orchestra and the Royal Danish Library. Welcome to our international live stream audience and to our analog audience here in the building. Morning. This is the second in a five-part conversation about the intersections of art and science as we consider a warming north and the implications of a transformed Arctic because of climate change. Our guests today have Indigenous roots in very different parts of Turtle Island, but they bring a common perspective on the power of art and entertainment to provoke activism and change public discourse. Jesse Wente is the chair of the Canada Council for the Arts, and Sven Hardenberg is a Greenlandic entrepreneur, politician, and also an actor in a very popular Netflix series called Borgen. Welcome to you both. So to start us off, I also just want to acknowledge that we are on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, and I personally am very grateful for their continued stewardship of this beautiful Timuch, their ancestral lands, and it's always really important to acknowledge that. So Cook, stay up to the Algonquin Anishinaabe. So we should really just continue the conversation we were having in the green room because it was really great. We were talking about all kinds of things, but in particular, I want to say, from my perspective as an Intlakamuch from British Columbia, which is the other side of the country, last summer, my community experienced an incredibly traumatic week of destruction, where we experienced plus 50-degree weather for about a week. In particular, like the official count was like 3 days of plus 50-degree weather, which culminated in a wildfire that destroyed my community, my hometown of Lytton, British Columbia. And so climate change is very real to me and my family and my community. And so this conversation about climate change is impactful to me personally. I witnessed as a youth growing up in Lytton, I literally watched a glacier evaporate over my childhood. So every summer there would still be this glacier above our community, and every year it got smaller and smaller and smaller until it was about 17 when this little glacier just disappeared. And then it never came back in the summer. It would still be like the snow patch in the winter, but it never came back in the summer. Wow. And it was like oh, one day it was gone, And so in my lifetime, my relatively short lifetime, I've witnessed the change in real measures, and culminating in these wildfires that we experience in British Columbia every summer. We now call it like the smoke season or the fire season because it's not just summer anymore. Every year the air quality in British Columbia becomes some of the worst in the world. And it's a province that prides itself as being supernatural British Columbia, but the wildfire situation has gotten so bad that it has destroyed my community. We had another fire there again this summer, and so it's a real threat. And I'm sure you can speak to the change in the Arctic as well that you've witnessed in your lifetime, Sven.
Yes, well, thank you for having me here. I really appreciate the invite. Well, in regards to climate change, we really see the effects of it in our part of the world. We see the increase of off-melt of the inland ice cap. It's getting quicker and quicker, and the numbers that they are analyzing, that it diminishes every year, is staggering. And we also see the changes in the weather conditions, much warmer weather in summer, and much more unpredictable weather situations. So we have the same kind of experience in our part of the world as you have been describing. Yeah.
We were talking in the green room there about the importance of water to our communities, not just as a resource, but our relationship to water. And I know that it's as this country holds probably the largest reserves of fresh water in the world, how important that is going forward, and our relationship to water going forward, and how we hold that. Can you speak to that a bit, Jesse?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, and thanks for being here, and I love your show. So I'm very excited to meet you. Well, I think like most things, at least from an Anishinaabe perspective, water would be nothing you would ever commodify in any way, just like you wouldn't commodify anything that you have to live on, because you immediately are deciding that some people won't be able to access something they need to live, which is not a great way to govern anything. But so I think we have to reorient sort of our whole position. Water, I think, is a particular subject. My community, Ganabajing, on the north shore of Lake Huron, what the government calls Serpent River First Nation, it had a water problem for much of my adult life. I don't live in the community, but they had real challenges accessing clean water, despite being an hour outside of Sudbury. Like, they're not exactly a remote place. And I think that speaks larger to the historic access issues that the Canadian government has sort of put in for our communities. Like, there's a reason why there's a water crisis in First Nations communities and not widespread in Canada. Right. And I think that's just the holdovers of colonialism. But I did want to also say, like, just to bring it back maybe to the subject, the first time I really understood or started to see like climate change and what it would mean was actually in the work of Zacharias Canuck, who's an Inuit filmmaker, a Inuk filmmaker. And he's been making videos in the north in Inuvik since 1983. And some of them, a lot of them are just capturing the knowledge of the elders. And a lot of what they spoke about in those early videos, Kevin, was of what they were seeing happening to the environment, and just describing the degradation of the ice and what it was doing to the animals. And it strikes me that part of why we're unprepared for the moment we're facing, this climate crisis where we've got wildfires, we've got flooding, we've got all of this happening globally, is actually because collectively these nations have refused to listen to what Indigenous people have been saying, probably ever, but certainly around this issues for many, many years. Like, I think if we'd actually engaged properly with these communities who are on the front lines of this change 40 years ago, the fires your community faces, none of that would be surprising, because they've, just like so many things, Indigenous people have been saying these things for a very long time, have been telling these truths. It's the accepting of those truths that has been the block for so many. And I think, we're coming to a time, Anishinaabe have prophecy about this, like you come to a time where the world does actually turn back. Mm-hmm. And I think we're coming to that time. I think the question for the world is, there's sort of two ways that happens. Like, there's the willing way, where you turn back because you realize you have to. And then there's the way where you are forced to because you have no choice. And one of those is way more pleasant than the other. And so I think we have to make that's sort of the choices we have to make now. It's not that we can get ourselves out of this. It's how unpleasant does this have to get as we try to get ourselves out of it.
Yeah, there's something about human nature that doesn't respond until it's an absolute crisis. And even then it's, by then it's way too late. But also it's the thing that gets you moving. Right?
Do you think that's true, though, Kevin, that that's human nature, or is that cultural nature?
Maybe it's cultural, yeah.
Because I don't think Anishinaabe, who think 7 generations in advance, do think like that.
Right.
Where you react for the crisis. The whole point of, like the Anishinaabe philosophy, and it was interesting to hear in the green room, your philosophy is exactly the same, which is there's no such thing as owning land. The land owns you. You live in relation to the land. But like some deed of paper is pointless. The land will like we can all disappear. Guess what will still be here? The land. Right? Like it's immutable. Like it's there. And so like, to me, it's a philosophical thing. We are in a culture that does not have long-term thinking and thus is surprised when consequences occur 30 years after an action. But that's a cultural thing. I think humans absolutely have the capacity to understand, if I plant a tree, I am not going to enjoy the shade, but someone 50 years from now is going to enjoy the shade, and that's the point. And so I think actually we have to, to use a very loaded term, decolonize our way of thinking, get out of quarterly report sort of measurement of literally anything, and get back to a human measurement, which is over lifetimes and over generations, and not this really short. Our communities, all three of us, did not persist, Anishinaabe, on these lands for 13,000 years because we were short-sighted thinkers. Right. We existed in this in sustainable way for 13,000 years precisely because we think about stuff far beyond our own lifetimes in terms of what the actual impacts are.
Right. I don't really agree on it's only a cultural thing. I think it's a systemic thing. And the whole system about investments and how you actually perceive development projects and so on are very short-term focused. And I think that's the main driver for how you are thinking projects.
I guess I would argue the system is a result of the culture. The
Yeah,
system
maybe
is not
at least the
immutable.
Western culture.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, okay,
That's what I mean.
sorry. Yeah, but we were discussing in the green room the differences between where we live, because we have this notion about you cannot buy land, you cannot own land. It's all about how we perceive if it's in the public's interest to utilize a certain piece of land for a certain purpose. So we use a lot of our resources to think about and discuss internally how we would use it. Somebody can apply for a project, but it's not necessarily the best project to be utilizing or to supporting. And that can be frustrating for investors because we don't follow the normal narrative of buying a place and then utilize everything there. You can establish whatever. So we have a completely different notion about how we want to move forward. And what I can hear on you guys, it's totally different here, right?
Well, I mean, I think we're more beholden to the investor class in terms of the systems here, yes.
Yeah.
I think there's a great, disappointing investors is sort of a thing that, like, this culture, like, the whole point is to please investors. And I would argue, in fact, disappointing investors should be like the new thing that we do all the time. and we should reframe that is actually an investment when we do that. It's an investment in humanness, not in a false economy thing that isn't in service of humans. An investment in life, we're investing in the ongoing of our species, which I think is an investment worth making much more than shareholder gain at any point.
I think the differences between our two places in the world when you're looking at Canada and Greenland is that even though our country is very big, we have very, very small population. We're only 56,000 inhabitants in the whole country. And that gives us certain freedom in regards to how to develop ourselves. But I think it would be totally different if we were like 4 million or 40 million or 400 million people living in our part of the world. So we are at the start of something.
Yeah.
Right? So we had time to actually rethink a lot of things, and we are developing from there, but I cannot predict how it will look like when we are looking like 100 years ahead.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we were talking also, and in this conversation as well, systems and how, and the way in which these cultures, these governments were created, and what their role was in that how they factored into the world. And Greenland and in terms of its relationship to Canada, they're very different creation stories, right? And I wonder how much the Indigenous influence in your country like bleeds into the policies and things like that.
I think it's fairly easy to say that we as Indigenous, we are in the country and deciding everything, right? Because we have our own government, we have our own parliament, we have our own legislative processes and everything. We control our own municipalities. So it's completely different because we are, I wouldn't say indigenous because we are Inuit in our own country, right?
Yes.
So it's a different notion. So it shifts in regards to how you perceive things.
Yes.
Because it's at least on the most relevant things for ourselves, we have a decision-making process that is ours. There's certain issues that we still need to have clearance from Denmark on security issues and so forth, but still it's in the process. So we cannot say that we are indigenous and have indigenous interests in our own country because we control it ourselves, right?
Yeah.
How interesting.
No, but there's also issues in regards to when we're looking from the overall perspective that there are different interests between Greenland and Denmark, obviously. We want to move forward with our own independence process, and it's not necessarily in the interest of the Danish parliament/government to support that. Mm-hmm. Right, so there's something completely different there. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, like when you look at it's interesting in the creation story of how this country, this construct that we call Canada today was, we were partners initially, right? There was a partnership that was then completely co-opted, and then we were like pushed aside, and those perspectives were pushed aside. And even in terms of like the wildfire situation in British Columbia, there was an indigenous knowledge about how you take care of the land by doing burns. So you would do, in the colder, wetter seasons, you would actually burn out a lot of the fuel that would cause problems in the summer. And it would also revitalize the land. So and you did it in a way that that was in sort of relationship to how the land works, because those forest stands, in fact, can't regerminate without a fire. So you need the fire, but when you let it run out of control, it takes over everything and it destroys everything in the hottest seasons. And so the indigenous people for thousands of years cultivated the land in that way, or that's the wrong word, but they
Steward. Provided stewardship.
Took care of it.
Yeah, for sure. And so that perspective is we've been like you said, we've been saying this forever and ever and ever, but it is only now sort of getting any kind of traction where people are taking it seriously. And I wonder if, are there examples of that as well in Greenland, where that indigenous knowledge or that stewardship or that Inuit knowledge factors into industry, or it factors into the ways in which you make those decisions?
I would say it's still in the process. It has been debated a lot because we have a tendency to fall back on academia because it's so strong in itself that they analyze things, they conclude things, and you cannot do a real qualified decision-making process, for example, about quotas on whales or fish and so on, unless it has a clear recommendation from the academia. But it's not really factored in regards to the indigenous knowledge. And it has been discussed on an ongoing basis since 2013 and just before that it has to be factored in as equal to balance it out. Because what we are lacking is the resources to do all the analysis of everything, to do a real academic backed decision-making process in that sense. Because you're not relying on ourselves with the indigenous knowledge when the fishermen are fishing the fish and they are everywhere, right? Yeah. So you don't embrace that knowledge when it comes in because it's not sectioned in the right proportions and packaged in the right way. So it cannot be embraced in that sense. And I don't know where we are going to land in regards to that, but hopefully we will move that forward and merge those kind of two things to secure that moving forward.
I wonder also, the three of us, we're involved in storytelling. And how does our work as storytellers, as people who are involved in media, to different degrees and in different ways, how can that help to transform, help to shape the societies in which we engage with? You have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, storytelling is how our societies are shaped in the first place.
Right.
Like we get asked those sorts of questions, or we think about that. I've come to learn, I guess, or understand that like stories are inextricable from practically anything. Because as an animal, that's our gift, is storytelling, right? We are the storytelling animal. Other animals don't have to tell stories about who they are and how they came to be there. Like the wolf is not ever not thinking it's a wolf or having to understand, but we do. And so I think that's intrinsically how we have to do it. And it's how everything we do is shaped in terms of the governments and all that stuff. So I think telling these stories will help provide the perspective. There's another act to that too, though, which is the listening and the understanding and the accepting, because you can tell all sorts of things if it's not sort of absorbed, that can be a challenge. And I think we're just getting to that point, right? Because our communities, at least here, and I know less about Greenland, but like here, we haven't had access to the storytelling mechanisms for most of their existence. It's only relatively recently that we've had those. And I also think it's only relatively recently that broader Canada has sort of figured out that maybe they should listen and sort of figure this out. And I think that's also because they've learned, they realize that maybe they don't know as much about living in this place as they think they would have thought of. And I'll tell you a very quick story to illustrate my point. I was in Banff, this was a few years ago, pre-pandemic, and I was very privileged enough to be with the Stoney Nakoda when they were reintroducing the bison to the park. And we had this fantastic sort of spend a day with them and really watch them. And the elders there told this hilarious story about how this process started. So I apologize to my Stoney Nakoda cousins. I'm going to tell this story. But they just laughed about how the fish and game warden or whatever, like the Ministry of National Resources came out because they're managing the reintroduction. And they asked the Stoney Nakoda, they're like, well, where should we put the buffalo and all this stuff? And they're giving them the feedback, but they don't take all of the feedback. And one of the things the sort of government folks, the game wardens, say to the Stoney Nakoda is that, well, you don't have to worry. We're going to put the buffalo there. Don't worry, they don't climb mountains. Is what they say to the Stoney Nakoda. And they're like, the elders all went, oh, okay, sure. And then in the presentation comes up a photo. They said, so the day after the buffalo were introduced, this is what happened. And they have a photo of a buffalo on top of a mountain. And they're like, we knew that the buffalo, like, that's what they do. They roam, and mountains are not, like, it's a buffalo. They don't care. They go up it. Like, to me, that is very illustrative of sort of the history of this place in a lot of ways. Like, our people going, the buffalo is just going to climb the mountain, and the official going, no, it'll be fine. The buffaloes don't climb mountains. And I think I actually think this is part of the root of why there's just across the West, particular in settler colonial nations, there's an increasingly distrust of the institutions and the governments and these things that they've built up, in part because they haven't listened. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence that in Canada we have a failing trust in institutions and democracy. At the same time, the truth of residential schools is coming to light. And that's because those very institutions that people are losing faith in are the ones that lied to you about this. And the truth is, that's a really hard thing to put back in the basket. Right. And I think that's true of the environment and a whole host of things where by not engaging and not hearing that the buffalo is going to go up the mountain and just saying, no, we know better, that's actually contributing to this mistrust, this loss of faith, this erosion of community, because it didn't. Like if we had just been honest and transparent with each other from the beginning, we wouldn't be here, but we weren't. And so now we're stuck and we don't know how to quite get back out of it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, things like the environment, these major issues are suffering because of our inability to see the truth or to sort of meet in that place. But I'm hoping that through storytelling, right, that the Stoney Nakoda can tell the story and it will sink in that, right, the buffalo are going to climb the mountain. So you sort of have to accept that that's what's going to happen and either don't put them near the mountain or just be like, that's what they do. They're buffalo, and accept it on that sort of, that level, and accept what we're saying, our communities are saying about water and all of these issues, right? Because I'm sure your community was saying the ice is melting for decades, and it's, who listens?
Well, I just recently came into the storytelling segment with a TV series. But I think, well, at least in our part of the world, we are very strong in storytelling. We have a very strong oral transfer of information and so on. That's just through history, right? That's where we are strong. But I would like to see that we gain more access to resources to strengthen that even more and tell our stories into people's homes. Because the narrative about telling a story through, for example, a TV series is so strong. Because people are embracing it. They are seeing it within their homes and they are accepting the premises of the storyline. I participated in Born because I could see the benefit of presenting a more modern Greenland. Because there was a lot of discussion under the writing process about what that should look like. And there was different views on it. And it was then promoted by the director that they wanted to show a more modern expression. And because of that, I accepted to try it out. And it was great. And I really acknowledge the power of the storytelling. But the narrative about, for example, Born is written out of a Danish perspective, right? And that's also the main storyline, that it's perceived out of a Danish minister in Denmark, the issues that she encountered. And we were discussing it also internally under the production phase. And they said, well, you just have to accept that it is out of a Danish perspective. And obviously we did, but they also said they would like to back us in regards to the different narratives that we could come with that are more true to how we see things. Because we don't have the economical resources to actually back productions like that one. Because that is very, very expensive to actually to pull such a production off, right? And it could be very, very interesting if we got access as indigenous or Inuits to that kind of economical backing to tell stories, because we're really good at it.
Yeah.
And here's where I will share. The Indigenous Screen Office, which is an organization I've helped create, is funding a project that's a collaboration between Inuit here and Inuit in Greenland. And traditionally, this was not allowed.
Right.
Because Canadian money couldn't be spent on a foreign production. But of course, Inuit Greenland, like what these folks would say is they speak the exact same language.
Yeah.
They're the same nation, Inuit, and that if they'd wanted to tell this story before Canada, the only barrier would have been a boat, right? That's it.
Yeah.
There wouldn't have been, some funder says it doesn't achieve CanCon. No, none of that would have existed. So the Indigenous Screen Office has been able to set it up so that we can fund that project regardless of the border, because the border isn't the Inuits. Right. The border is some fabrication of colonialism. So that's part of the way we we're approaching this
Right.
is like, why should I be why should, and I mean, I'm not Inuit, but like, why should my Inuit cousins be separated from their relations by this false border when it comes to storytelling?
Right.
When it comes to speaking this most human of activities. I don't think it should be barriered. And so that to me is an example of how we can begin to inject some, I don't want to call it indigenous thought, but just like some sovereignty, as I'm a big proponent of sovereignty for our folks, into these systems by like saying, yeah, that rule is set up for like, I don't know who that rule is exactly set up for, but not us.
Right.
And so allow us the freedom to do that, because we realize that Greenland doesn't have, it doesn't have a Canada Council for the Arts, let alone an Indigenous Screen Office. It doesn't have those sorts of funding supports. But what I love about this particular moment in storytelling is I can watch your show in my living room.
Yeah.
And I can also tweet or like text with my friend in Taiwan who is also watching their show in your living room. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of corporations involved in that, and I want to put that aside for the second. But the idea that we can access this level of storytelling just so easily is awesome. Like,
It is.
as a film geek who grew up in the 80s, like, to get a movie from like Greenland or Denmark required real effort, Kevin. Like it required international postage is what it required. Like, it was a whole thing to see those movies. Now it can be just a click away. Corporations get involved in that. But like, I think there's a lot to be said that as human beings, the possibility to be more connected and more understanding of one another is so much greater now. Like, look at how we're doing this. Like, if we'd done this even 20 years ago, the only people who would have heard this are the people in the room.
Yeah.
Right.
Right? But now there's all this potential for this conversation, and I think there's just unlimited potential in how we could totally transform, I don't want to say the world, but at least how we relate to the world and how we're behaving in relation to the world through this storytelling. It's why I think this moment is so important, that we use these tools to do this. Like, we need Indigenous people to tell our stories right now, and as big a variety of stories on all of these platforms. And to not put this too strong a point, but like, the species might really require this moment. And so we should lean in. And I hope it's not too late, right? Because like the Screen Office, the dedicated Indigenous program at Canada Council, like, these are all very recent.
Yeah, Indigenous Theatre at the NAC.
Indigenous Theatre at the NAC. These are very recent events. I hope that we can, that it gets wide enough, the effect is wide enough that we can change course a little bit, and that we see more shows that are by Inuit in Greenland.
I think there's more on the way, but it's still fairly small productions in that sense. So, but I know there's movement in the area. Just recently in Nuuk, there was a premiere of a new horror movie, locally produced. But it just to give you an example on how much time and effort it takes, it took them 5 years to actually shoot it and post-produce it and then finalize it, because there's not a lot of resources to tap into in our part of the world. So,
Well, we make an effort, not an effort, but we make a priority of having Inuit content in our seasons as well. And so in our first season, we had an Inuit circus piece that was immensely popular from Arc Cirque. We have a show in this season, The Breathing Hole, which we're doing a drum workshop in Joe Haven this week, next week, right now. And with Greenlandic and Inuit artists from across Canada as well, and Inuit director, Inuit co-author. And so, and we have another show as well that we're partnering with French Theatre in the building with coming up as well. And so that'll be ongoing. Like we Indigenous theatre, we try to we make a priority of having that broad representation on the, and that's the thing. It's not just the representation, but it's the embodiment of our ideas, our culture, our languages as well. That's the other part too, is hearing our languages in these media, in these forms, in these in the storytelling, and how important those indigenous concepts are embedded in the language. And so representing and having those in the art form is so vital and important.
I mean, I remember my first year working at the Toronto International Film Festival was 2006, and the opening film that year was the Journals of Knud Rasmussen, the Zach Canuck feature, the first Inuit feature to ever open, I think the first and only Inuit feature to have ever opened the Toronto Film Festival. I was a new programmer then, the first Indigenous programmer in the history of the festival, and I sat in Roy Thompson Hall when that premiere played. And to hear, and it's not even my language, but to hear Inuktitut in that theater, I cried.
Yeah.
You know, and I cried because it meant that Anishinaabe Moan might one day be heard in that theater. Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, the Canada Council just wrapped up a whole northern tour. We were part of the Arctic Arts Summit,
Yes.
which gathered circumpolar nations to talk about arts and culture. We've had a really renewed commitment to artists in the North, frankly, because they've been underserved for the entire history of the Canada Council and the cultural sector of Canada. Even though I would argue internationally, arts from the North here are very well recognized. Like it's part of what would define Canadian culture to the rest of the world is the arts from the North. So I think we're seeing that renewed investment. And just as a plug, I can't wait to see that horror movie because Inuit have the scariest stories I have ever heard in my life. I'm getting chills. They've told me some of these stories, Kevin. I'm sure you've heard some. I know you know them.
Yeah. But I'm
Folks.
thinking, could there be like a more openness to exchange different like shows or movies and so on a broader scale? Because it's like we don't really have good connection between our neighboring countries. And I think it's a pity because we had a flight route going from Nunavut to Greenland like 20 years ago. And it stopped because of changing buying patterns from some of the supermarkets in Greenland. But we need more interconnectivity in the sense of moving people back and forth, goods, but also culture. And also popular culture, like movies and shows and so on, right? It could be very, very interesting.
I mean, yes is the answer. I'm not sure I'm fully in charge of that, but at least I have some say in that.
But I think that work is happening, right? Like I think those again, it's like having that. I hate to use the word, but like the beachhead of being in these like institutions as Indigenous people to be able to make those connections occur, right? Like again, it's about resourcing, it's about being at the table, it's about having a platform to be able to like make these connections and present work and showcase work and be a part of work across circumpolar region, across Turtle Island, and around the world. Like in our first season at here at the NAC for Indigenous Theatre, we had a gathering of 78 Indigenous artists from all over the world come here to talk and to share their perspectives on the work that they do in the storytelling that they do. And the commonalities are so strong. It doesn't matter what part of the world you're coming from. And so I think
I would love to see that, and I think what would work best is to look at local agreements between Nunavut and Greenland, and because one of the challenges in Canada is the entire cultural sector and most industries are based in a very thin band across the southern border.
Yeah.
And so like the Canada Council's approach now to the North is less, we're going to go to the North and tell you how to do things because that's dumb. So instead, it'll be partnering with people who are already there and basically allowing them to do what they need to do to make it work there and just funding that. And so I think that would be the way I would approach it is get the Northern folks to make the agreement and get the Southern folks just to pay for it and get out of the way of it. Because I think it's too, part of this whole, at least part of the way I've tried to approach the cultural sector is like increasingly get, at least for our folks, get folks out of the way.
Right.
Like you know, let us do what we need to do and don't be, I hate to use gatekeepers because it's a weird thing, but like we know what we need to do.
Right.
So, and do it. And then the other big thing I think that we should be thinking about, especially for the North, is to stop treating it as a place of extraction, right? Like where you go there to take something away from it. And this includes culture. Like the North needs culture for itself.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's no museums, there's no big galleries, there's no big performance spaces in the North. That's not right. Like the reality is like most Northern Inuit artists, like let's just take a carver, for example, their work does not stay in the North. Their community never sees it again. They carve it, they sell it to someone in the Southern gallery, and it is gone. The community never gets the chance to experience it. That's not right. Like, I get that that's sort of the whole point of this place. It shouldn't be. Like, we need culture for culture's sake to make vibrant communities, healthy communities for humans to feel fully there. So like there should be schools and libraries and all of this in all of those places. There should be art centers, performing arts places, galleries, so that, because why do we get it all down in the South?
Yeah.
Like, why do we have this? I mean, literally the National Arts Center, and I go to Nunavut and they don't.
Yeah.
That ain't right.
Yeah.
And so like and so I want to see that. I want to see, because those are our people. And like, why should we have to always sell outside of our communities? Why can't we have that enrichment here? Why can't we have movie theaters? Or if not movie theaters, access to streaming service. So it's not like the joke in Iqaluit used to be, if you want to have movie night on Friday night, well, you decide the week before because that's how long it's going to take it to download. And it's like, but that's not fair either, because the reality is that access is a challenge for both the consumer who wants to watch your show, but also for the makers of your show. Because if they want to be there, how hard is it to create that show if you're in Nunavut and you can't download, so you block both the creation and the dissemination. So I think we have to allow those communities to have the art and not think that it has to be in the South to be relevant. It doesn't. Maybe it should stay there, and if we want to go see it, we have to go there, and maybe we don't go there. We just have to admire it from afar. But the idea is, because I know not a lot of them want us up there, but I think we should be more accepting of that. I think we have a culture where it's like, well, if it's beautiful, we want it here where we can see it. It's like, no, maybe it should stay with those folks, and that's okay. Right? We didn't carve totem poles. Like, nations did not carve totems to be in museums.
Right.
They carved them to stay there.
I'm always fascinated by all the Inuksuks across the southern Canada, right? Like all of the
On the drive here, I saw a few, and I was like, I wonder who put that up.
I don't know, but it's so true. Like I think there is something about that we do. Well, we don't, but well, I guess we do. We culturally, where we are happy to sell Indigenous art, but we're not as happy to support it in the community where it's from, just as you said. And I think that goes for the North as it goes for Indigenous communities as well. I think that is, we're always grateful when there's a powwow dancer or somebody doing, a carving, and people can come and watch that. Often those are shipped all over the world, and yet the communities where those come from are often left without the resources to be able to keep that sort of sustaining in a meaningful way. And I think it's a part of the sort of greater culture of being a colonial state that is about exporting everything and shipping everything away from here, from the lands. I wonder if now is a good time to maybe take the audience in and take some questions from the house, perhaps. You all have been sitting here listening intently, and perhaps you have some questions for our panelists. We have a microphone, and if you have a question, feel free to.
I have a question. So you weren't an actor before?
It was my first acting job.
Wow,
show.
you're really good.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you. I didn't know that I had that talent.
No? And you had never performed before or thought of it?
Well, I've been a CEO for many years in different capacities, so have many employees and so on. And when you are very aware on how you perform, I'm not saying it's an act, right?
No,
But
I understand. I understand.
But when you are aware of it, it gives you certain abilities to secure that the kind of message you want to pass upon whoever that's in the receiving end, it's more or less the same thing. It's different because when you are on a TV show and the camera is closing up on you, it's completely different the way that you work with it.
Yeah.
So I had to learn it very quickly.
Which is not to say, though, you're not recommending all CEOs act. I think we should need to put that out.
I think, yeah, but I actually like the job of acting because it's totally different from what I've done before.
Sure.
Totally.
Because this is only on you and your own ability to actually transform a message through how you say things and how you do it with your.
And you found it easy to identify and sort of embody the character?
I had to really work with it.
Yeah.
And I put a lot of effort in it, and I'm really happy that people acknowledge it, because it was hard work for me, because it was the first acting job, and many of my colleagues were very, very, or are still very, very professional, and they actually set the bar on what I have to deliver on, and that was hard.
Well, you did really well.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I didn't mean.
No, that's great. That was awesome.
I was just. I thought you were an actor. Like I did. Anyway.
No, many of the actors on the show, when we were shooting it, thought that I was a real actor.
And none of
And-
are they also CEOs or no?
No.
Okay.
Professional actors.
Okay.
Yeah. So
You were just acting.
I
like
fooled
an actor.
everybody.
You did. Do we have any questions from the house? What about our? We can also take questions from our streaming audience. If anybody wants to type a question into the chat, we'll have somebody read it out. Silence from the house. We've answered all your questions. Oh, there we go.
Miigwech, thank you. Tusen tak. This is such a spectacular conversation and so heavily needed at this time and also times before and times upcoming. I was very interested, Jesse, when you mentioned that there is, I can't quite remember the term that you used, but almost like it's not premonition, but what is going to be coming next, this returning to whether it will be
The prophecy, yeah.
the prophecy, that's the word, thank you. I would love to hear a little bit more about that. And then I'm also curious, in your cultures, do you also share this kind of a prophecy?
You know, in our part of the world,
Yeah.
about
Well, there's several prophecies the Anishinaabe have. One of there's the seventh and eighth prophecies of the eighth fire, which is just the idea that at some point the non-Anishinaabe, meaning non-indigenous really, come to learn that they need to learn from us in order to, and so there's a turning back. And, depending, I'm not an elder in that way, and so you'd be better talking to some of them, because there's some dispute in terms of where we are necessarily in the prophecy. But I think there's certainly a suggestion that we're close to the completion of it, and the signs for that have been, youth re-engaging with the language and sort of a revitalization of the culture sort of coming back from our own people, but also signs that the colonial culture is in distress, and that those are symbols that we're sort of getting there. And, you know, in terms of, you know, I mentioned the idea of like there's two sort of different pathways. And what we mean by that is like, there's the one where there's a realization by humanity that they have to live in a different way. And so there's a return to looking at more traditional knowledge and ways of being and ways of understanding in order to facilitate that. And then there's the other part where something really bad happens and people are sort of forced to reconnect with what it is to live in a sustainable way and thus have to relearn a lot of those skills. It's unclear to me, and again, you'd be better off talking to some more versed. It's unclear to me like what the choice point or how like any of that happens, other than, well, we can sort of look at what's happening, right? And I would say both are still possible to me, in that like there's still an opportunity for the world to like go, maybe some of the systems we're living under aren't working in the way that we had thought they would, and we need to change. And I can also say, like, it looks like some of these systems are in collapse, and we're having some real. Looks like there are going to be real challenges for global humanity coming up. So that's sort of what but you can Google. I'm sure you'll find answers, and you know, Elder Duke Redbird and others. They're the folks that help me sort of figure some of that stuff out. But it's yeah, that's sort of the baseline of it. I can't get too into detail because it's not really my story to share in that way. But I also think it's sort of obvious too. Like if you're paying attention and you're awake at this moment in history, right? Like there's some real challenges for particular democracies in settler colonial states. They're really struggling. Frankly, the democracies in their colonial parent states are also struggling a little bit. In the global south, we're having massive environmental challenges and huge immigration, like migration patterns that we all knew were coming, like that all. So like, I think you're seeing some of it, and you're also seeing that there is a growing interest in what our folks have been saying and how we view the world, which is very, very different than, at least from an Anishinabe's perspective. If anything, COVID really laid it bare, because if you've ever been to an Anishinaabe feast, you'll know the who eats first and who eats last, right? It's the elderly and the children eat first. And in COVID, who were the communities that this culture threw under the bus the quickest were the elderly and kids. And so it was very disorienting, and it to me was very stark and like, oh, like we're not operating under the same understanding if that's the route we take. So I think you can sort of also see some of evidence of why Anishinaabe people might think that we're in that process.
I think it's a little different in our part of the world also because what I said before, that our structure is different. We decide on our own. We have our own parliament, our own government. We have our own policy-making processes and so forth. And we have a different structure. As I also mentioned before, we cannot buy land, we cannot own land. And it gives a totally different perspective on how to utilize our resources. And we have a special process around it where we discuss our own interests in how to utilize it. And that is different in the way how to perceive it and how to actually make decisions around it. So we don't have the same kind of predicaments. And it's just to give that kind of perspective because it's totally different, right? So we are trying to utilize our own resources out of our own interest that is sustainable. That's also why that our government has declined further explorations within oil and gas, because it's not a part of the future. It's a part of the past. At least that's the narrative storytelling that we are actually putting out there, that we have said no to it because we want to do it differently. So we are looking very much into the renewable space and utilizing our resources that way. We have huge hydropower potentials that we want to utilize, and that's a part of our future. So it's different, right?
So part of the prophecy may be to watch what Greenland is doing a little more closely, you know.
We have a similar prophecy about the return of Coyote, and Coyote being Inshinkayap, being like our sort of central hero figure, transformer being, not like a robot, but like somebody who could transform and shape-shift the world around him. The story goes that when Coyote, because Coyote was destroyed, sort of around the coming of the colonizers, Coyote sort of vanished, and they say he was destroyed and dismembered, and body parts were thrown all over the nation. And then when he comes back, it signals the return of the culture, return of the people standing up, the return of all of these things, similar to what you were talking about, but in our own Intlakatmuk interior Salish way.
It's so interesting, Coyote, because Coyote's a big character for Anishinaabe, Wasajachak.
Trickster too,
Trickster.
right? And you know, I say I'm Salish, but I'm an interior Salish, and our culture is much more akin to almost like a. It's not like the Plains, but we hunted buffalo with the Plains relatives, and we sort of we share a lot of similar cultural sort of values or stories. We have animals in our stories that don't actually exist in our territory, like antelope, things like that. And so because we traveled to those territories and we hunted them, and we shared with, you know, so often we're thought of as Indigenous people, we're thought as static. Like we didn't move anywhere. We existed on our reserves and we never left them. But, you know, we ranged for thousands of kilometers and traded all around. So anyway, so the story of Coyote returning is a story of the culture's revitalization that I think we're seeing. As you said, like the children learning the language, songs and things coming to life again, and being spoken on in gatherings and in public, and coming out from being asleep after a long time.
Because, I mean, I think one of the important things is that, at least for our, and it sounds like our nations share similar viewpoints, is that, like, colonialism is just a thing that happens, but it doesn't stay. Do you understand? Like, and that the taking away, there is also a return. And when I mean a return of everything. That's what is foretold. So, that this cycle is I don't want to call a natural one, but is one that was expected, I would say, that you would see that, right?
We do have an online question.
Great.
So the question is, as climate change in the Arctic is happening now and at a faster rate than elsewhere in the world, and with major implications for peoples of the Arctic, what roles can Indigenous communities play globally to make a systemic change shift happen?
I think that's a big question. Also because I think it's difficult to, when we are relaying the stories from our part of the world on the effects of climate change, it's been listened to, but the decision-making process that has to follow to alter the way that you do things is lacking. Because everything is so short-term. Everybody needs their car, pay the mortgage, and there's a lot of things that you need to do on the short-term perspective. And we're talking about long-term perspectives here, that you need to do something now that may affect something in 10 years, in 100 years. And that's too long a perspective for normal people and governments and systems to actually adopt, because they have their quarterly reports and they have to set up earning results and so forth. So they are. It's difficult. It counteracts, right?
It is. It's a good question, a really challenging one, because I mean, Indigenous people, what power do we have all the time to make the change? I mean, telling the story is a certainly important part. I think sometimes not doing, like one might call it civil disobedience or whatever, but like not doing things that people may want to do. would be another part of it. I think also important would be to understand that while, yes, because I think there's a lot of the framing of the thing is like the North sees more of the climate change. I think we have to connect the dots between what the North sees and, like, for example, what's going on in India right now, because they are the same thing. They're not unrelated. They're exactly the same thing. And so, like, we can't just say, oh, and folks in the North are feeling it. No, what's going to happen is we're going to witness it, and the folks in the global South are the ones that are actually going to suffer immediately the worst. They already are. And so we have to start to take a more global viewpoint, I think, of some of those things and connect the dots. And then I would get back to, because you mentioned, I think, so many really smart things, which is like maybe what we need to do, and I had hoped always that the pandemic would maybe provide this moment for us, is like rethink about how we run our societies. Like, so we have a few major human level issues we have to get to, environment being maybe the biggest. So how do we free up the capacity for humans to actually address this issue? I would say the biggest way we could do that is make sure that all humans are housed, fed, and healthy, regardless of cost, because the cost isn't a real thing. So, like, if everyone knew where their next meal was coming from, knew they had a place to sleep that was safe, and that they could be healthy in that, then they might be free to, like, figure out, well, how do I clean up the river next to my house? Or how do I participate in this? And instead, because of the systems we've decided to exist under, multitudes of people are involved in their daily existence as their fundamental issue. That they have to figure out how I'm going to eat, sleep, and survive tomorrow, to see tomorrow. We're not going to be able to tackle the major issues if the majority of us are involved in that on a daily basis. And that's why I, the Canada Council, at least for our government, probably at this point, to their annoyance, advocate for things like universal basic income or guaranteed basic income, not because we think it would benefit just artists, but I do think it would benefit artists, but I would advocate it for all Canadians, because if you want a real innovative culture, take away basic survival as something people have to worry about. Then they are going to be much freer to innovate, make the new gadget that's going to capture solar power and power a car or whatever, run a car on your salad leftovers from that last night. Like, I think all of those may be very well possible, but the person who has that idea and knows how to do it right now is figuring out, I can't sleep tomorrow, or I've that's what they're engaged in. Because I don't think knowledge accrues in a class system. I think the class system would like to think that, but that's not true. So in fact, if you want to unlock the real human potential of humans, it's making sure they're not engaged in maintaining their own humanity as much as we have forced people to be engaged in. And if we could do that globally, where you actually have billions of people who now don't have to worry about survival and can instead tackle the major issues we're facing, then we might be able to get somewhere. But it would require us to realize we can't continue to invest in a system that does not invest in us, that actually has no interest in us other than our ability to consume or generate wealth for other people. And it's just, we need to not do that. And because I think that's how we solve these things. It's like, we created this mess. The fish and all the other creatures are looking to us to help them get out of it, and we owe it to them because they sustain us. Like, if we don't have the fish, who are we kidding? We are toast. So, like, we owe it to them. That's the right relationship. I think we all know this because this is baked into us. Yeah. It's like, you don't kill every moose because what are you going to eat next year? Like, that is just not a thing you can do. So, and yet, here we are. So I think that, to me, if we could get Canada to do that, and I hope it will be an issue in the next election. I really hope that's, because we're not alone, and there's been a whole wave of people pushing the government to do this. And I hope it is an election issue, because I think Canada can afford it. I actually think Canada can't afford not to do it. And I think if we want to truly reach our potential in any measure that you want to take, even if you want to count economic growth under this, I think this would unlock way more economic growth than any tax break you are ever going to give anyone. Like you want to free up people to really earn, become top earners, free them from this nonsense. And I'll say, I know I'm going on a bit of a tirade, but I'll just quickly say, there was no poverty or houselessness on these lands until there was Canada.
Yeah.
Canada created these issues. They are not native to this place. They just aren't. These are forced upon our people, on all sorts of people. Why? There's no reason for it. Canada? Are you kidding? This is a place of vast abundance. Vast. That's why our folks settled here. We could have kept walking. We could have gone somewhere else. Florida. God, that would have been.
Or Greenland.
Or Greenland. Might be nice.
Yeah.
In Greenland. But we settled there because it's fantastic. Get outside. You can go in Ottawa right away and be like, wow, it's awesome. And I wish Canada, I say this as someone who's been engaged in Canadian culture my entire professional life. There's always been this struggle for Canadian culture. What is Canadian culture? I'd suggest open a window and look out. If you want what Canadian culture is, it's right there. All our cultures are based on what is right outside your window. You want to know how our cultures came to be? It's the land. It's always the land. So if you want to know what is distinct about Canadian culture, just open your window and step out the door and take a deep breath. Go drive. If you're in a city, drive 30 minutes. Pick a direction. Most Canadian cities, that's all it takes, 30, 40 minutes. Toronto, because of traffic, maybe an hour. But and you will be in a place where it's wow, look at this. What more culture? This is it. This is no wonder. And how can this not sustain everyone? It can. It can sustain everyone here very pleasantly. It just may mean that some people don't get to have 7 houses and 12 cars and all this stuff. And you know what? They don't need it. It's okay. They'll be fine. Yeah. So that would be my thing.
Well, I think that's a really great way to end this conversation. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this wonderful talk.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Watch his show. It's so
Watch the
great.
show.
So great.
Come see more of the Sphere Festival, and thank you all. Kukstea.